You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hi, folks. I'm Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining me today. I learned something pretty shocking this week. The Linguistic Society of America says every 40 days, a language dies. In fact, 3,000 languages across the world are endangered today. This is one of them.
いらんからって、はい。いらんからって。いらんからって。
That's a group of students saying hello in the Ainu language. It's spoken in northern Japan, but not by very many. Today's episode is all about stemming the loss of language, why and how. We're focusing on Japan and South Korea with Michiyo, Ishida, and Suk. Hi, ladies. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Hi, Teresa.
You know, people always talk about endangered animals, right, and the threats they face. But the idea of having languages on the brink of extinction is fascinating to me and terribly unfortunate. Mitch, we just heard a bit of the Ainu language off the top there, and I did some reading. I was so surprised to learn that it doesn't actually have roots in any other language. When did you come across it for the first time? Did you have any idea it existed when you were growing up?
Well, yes, I did know that Ainu existed, especially the people of Ainu, but I didn't really know anyone who was Ainu or anyone who came out to say they were Ainu.
I want to get a sense of just how unique the Ainu language is. So when you hear it, does it sound familiar in any way? Are there any similarities to Japanese, for example?
Let me give you an example. I think I'm more familiar with the language of Okinawa in southern Japan. Their language is different from the general Japanese language. Okinawans don't hide their heritage, for instance, which is linked to the Ryukyu kingdom. And there are popular Okinawa songs. So in that sense, I'm familiar to the sound of Okinawan language, but I don't know any popular Ainu songs, for instance. I had no sense of what Ainu sounded like until I went to Hokkaido to meet those of Ainu blood recently. And I attended several Ainu classes by Kenyu Yamamura, who's 30 years old and who is of Ainu blood. I learned how to say the greetings you heard in the beginning. Ikarakaratte, hello, please hello. You have to know that there's a small P, as in many Ainu words, Ikarakaratte. And there's a word sap, small P, sup, is a plural form of people going down the river. One word can express sometimes a whole sentence, but I really couldn't link any of the words to the Japanese language, so it's really hard.
Yeah, definitely unique. Many countries around the world are losing languages, and South Korea is one of them. Suk, there's a small community on Jeju Island that speaks a vanishing language. It's called Jeju-eo. Did I say that correctly?
Teresa, is Jeju-o. All meaning language in Korean. And yes, I think, there are lots of people around the world who have been to Jeju Island, and it is very possible that some of them would have heard the Jeju people speaking a dialect, a language that's slightly different from the standard Korean. But, Jeju-o is the language that was spoken by most of the people living in Jeju in the past. But, as there were more exchanges and more people going back and forth from Jeju Island to the mainland, many people in Jeju started to pick up the Korean language. And so the original Jeju language started to disappear. Now, I remember traveling to Jeju Island, say, about 20 years ago. And that time, I really did have a difficult time trying to understand what the residents there were saying, because the vocabularies, the grammar, they were all very different to what I knew from the standard Korean. These days, you go to Jeju Island, I think a lot of people would be able to understand what they're saying, but, with a bit of this Jeju dialect. But when you talk about the small community there, we're talking about the elderly population, like the women divers, whose average age is, say, 70 years old, and they still speak the original Jeju among themselves, since the younger people there don't understand it or speak it anymore. So, Teresa, let's listen to what one women diver said to me about this dying Jeju language.
It's a shame. Sometimes when we talk among ourselves using the very old Jeju language, we break out laughing because the old Jeju language has very funny words. When we go to Seoul and speak the Jeju language, people think we came from overseas.
So Suk, you mentioned most of these women who speak Jeju are 70. That means time is running out, right? The language itself also just doesn't have the same currency it once had, I think. How hard is it to preserve?
Well, yes, definitely. And it is very difficult because, as you said, many of those who speak the language now are the elderly people living in Jeju Island, and there's not that many of them left on Jeju Island now. And so, while I was doing this story, I got a sense that, even the Jeju government or the people living there didn't realize the importance of preserving this language. And it was really only after UNESCO in 2010 designated Jeju as critically endangered that the Jeju government and the people there started to think, hey, maybe it's time for us to try and preserve this language before it gets lost. So now if you go around Jeju Island, you'll be running into a lot of the writings in Jeju language that were used in the old days, and that's no longer used here in South Korea. And what they're trying to do is to raise the awareness of the language to the Jeju residents, but also to the average South Koreans who don't realize this too. And many there now are starting to realize and be aware that their language could be disappearing. And in fact, when we were there doing the story, I met a group of people from the Jeju Dialect Institute who actually go around the elderly communities there to hear stories from them about everyday things about how they lived in the past, but also like how they celebrated the traditional Korean holidays, because apparently culture is very related to the language. So let's listen to what one director, Kang Young-bo of the Jeju Dialect Institute, told me.
When society changes, so does the language. Like in the Haenyeo society, children used to watch Haenyeo return from the sea, and they would be fed some of the catch, like seaweed and conch. But that does not happen anymore. And so the word kesok, which came from that cultural act, no longer exists. And that is what is concerning.
Michiyo, a lot of these threatened languages are completely oral. Ainu is completely oral. There's no written component. What other challenges did you find stand in the way of its preservation?
Well, many of those of Ainu descent, they did not want to be open about their heritage, and many still don't wish to. There's a history of discrimination. Their culture, history was undermined. Those in their 60s and 70s told me that even though they knew their Ainu connection, they were not encouraged to speak in the Ainu language. Now, the area I visited in Hokkaido, Shiraoi town, traditionally had a large Ainu community and still does have. So they claim they are more open about their heritage, and they have some recordings of the past. And they have recordings of their grandparents, for instance, so they have at least heard what the Ainu language is like, while in other parts of Hokkaido, there are many people who may not have heard what the language is like at all. I spoke to one of the leading members of the National Ainu Museum and Park, which opened in 2020 in Shiraoi town. It's a 64-year-old Miyuki Muraki, and Miss Muraki explains.
The opportunity to speak it was taken away, but it was not banned. Other practices were banned. Tattoos were banned. Men were banned from wearing big earrings. Japan's position is that there is just one Japanese culture, one language, and history.
Michiyo, your report talks about that historical discrimination against Ainu people, which some say may have driven them to stop speaking it altogether. Why, then, is the revival of this language important? You talk to people who are studying the language. Why do they even bother doing it?
Well, those who were studying Ainu, who were not of Ainu blood, lived in Hokkaido, but had never heard of the Ainu language. They were actually curious to learn and thought it was relevant to them because they lived in Hokkaido. They were only aware that 80% of cities, towns, and villages' names actually derive from the Ainu language in Hokkaido. This includes like the cities of Sapporo, it's the capital of Hokkaido, ski resorts, world-famous Niseko, Rurutsu, they're Ainu names. Now, reviving the language is significant. Let's put it this way, that a loss of language would mean a loss of tradition, culture, knowledge, and the possible measure to unveil human history. There's still a lot of mystery about the Ainu people, so of course the Ainu language, and scholars are not even clear about their roots. Also, that's the case about the Japanese. And Ainus were said to have lived not only in Hokkaido, but also in the Tohoku area or northeastern Honshu area of Japan, which is now Aomori and Akita prefectures. And they are also said to have lived in what's now the Kurils and parts of Sakhalin in Russia. And in the past century, historians say that they led a life being pushed by the Russians and the Japanese people. The Ainu people were under pressure to denounce their tradition here in Japan, and with that, many hid their Ainu identity. So there's a lot that has been lost already, and an extension of the Ainu language will be a major blow. So in 2007, the United Nations declared the rights of the indigenous people, and the Japanese government came under pressure to recognize them. And following that, the government passed a resolution to recognize the Ainu as indigenous people of Japan. So it's just really recent. And in 2014, the Shinzo Abe government approved a new facility to promote ethnic harmony in Shiraoi town in Hokkaido, where I visited. And that became the Ainu National Museum and Park, or in short called Upopoi, meaning let's sing in Ainu. And on the back of such political environment, the preservation of Ainu culture and language became a government interest. And this is a complete reversal of what the Meiji government of the late 1800s was doing, forcing the Ainu people to become integrated with Japanese society, pressuring them to leave their centuries of practice important to them. And this also discouraged them to speak the Ainu language.
Yeah, it sounds like efforts to protect it have really galvanized. And I think it's because there's a recognition that this language is a treasure, right? And you don't want that to disappear. Yun-suk, earlier we heard Michiyo attempt speaking Ainu. You tried learning a bit of Jejuo. How did that go?
I did, but it was a disaster, and I don't think I am even going to try to say a few of the words because it is very different from the Korean that I know and that I speak here in the capital, Seoul. But, just touching on what Michiyo said, there was no discrimination and no discrimination even now for people speaking Jejuo, but I think it was something that the Jeju people sort of like brought it on their own because they just felt that, a lot of the young people would go to the capital, Seoul, after high school or so to study. And many felt that they just felt as if they were from the countryside and they didn't want to let people know that they were from Jeju. And so they stopped speaking with the vocabs or the grammar. And I think that was, unfortunately, that was the reason why a lot of young people now don't speak it. But, talking about me trying to learn the language. Yes, it was very difficult. I had this grandmother at this little grocery store trying to teach me, and I think she gave up after a while. But, it was very difficult.
So you talk about those young people. When we think about the next generation, what sort of efforts are they putting in schools? Social media is, of course, a big thing. Is that playing a role in keeping the tradition alive?
Well, yes, it is. Now that the Jeju government, feels that they need to do something to try and preserve this, there are efforts being made by the schools and even the social media to try to do what they can to do this. And so the Jeju government has made it compulsory for Jeju elementary schools to teach at least 11 hours a year of Jeju language and the culture. Now, you may say, 11 hours might be nothing. And in a way, it is. I mean, it's very difficult for them to learn a language in 11 hours. But what they're doing is it's like how when we went to school, we would have, say, French classes or Spanish classes. But in Jeju elementary schools, they don't have a special class catered to the Jeju language, but it is naturally just incorporated into the normal classes that they carry out now. Say, for example, the storytelling class, and there the teacher would be using vocabularies and games to get the children interested in this language and the culture. And the principal of one school that we went to, the Shin Jeju Elementary School, was saying that, students can get frustrated and bored with just learning the Jeju language. And so she decided to use this way of teaching. Also, we met this one YouTuber who was in his 20s, and apparently he was doing other contents before, didn't get too many people interested. And so he switched to Jejuo, where he goes around and meet the elderly people, say in a shop or anywhere out in the streets. He would talk to them, and then he would put that video content up, and he was surprised that there was just so much interest in, especially the young people, about the Jejuo language, the culture. And right now he has more than 276,000 viewers. And so, he too admits, I must say that he too admits that when he goes around and speaks to the elderly people, he has a very difficult time understanding them too. But it just shows how much interest there is. Unfortunately, he started a bit too late, but perhaps, with the young people getting a bit interested in it, there's just a little bit of hope for the language.
So hearing you speak and Michiyo speak about these languages, I get a sense of optimism, of hope. What's your sense, though, of the future of Ainu and Jejuo? Mitch, do you think all these efforts are just prolonging the inevitable, or will these languages survive to the next generation and beyond?
Well, the good news is that at least the Japanese government is setting aside a huge budget to operate, for instance, the National Ainu Museum and Park, or Upopoi, which opened in 2020. And on the back of the encouragement of the Japanese government, there is a momentum among scholars here, especially at universities and institutes in Hokkaido, to revive the Ainu language, and attempts at the local level, such as commuter buses running announcements in the Ainu language on express trains, for instance. And there are schools attempting to revive the Ainu language too, but it's not like what Yunsuke has been telling us about, the attempts there in South Korea. It's more like just having fun with the Ainu language once in a while. It's not compulsory or anything of that sort. Having said all that, there are still many of those who hide their Ainu identity, their parents, grandparents, who don't want to talk about their identity, their Ainu blood. And, in fact, there is no requirement in Japan for national registration to indicate your Ainu blood. So we don't know. We don't know how many people of Ainu blood there are in Japan. There could be many more than some people imagine. There could be much less, but we don't know. But, what we know is that they are Japanese. They're Japanese nationals. So for now, we have to wait and see if more who hide their roots will be willing to come out and not face discrimination. And that's really important, that they will not face discrimination anymore in this country.
Well, I think some part of the Jejuo, the words, some of the vocabulary, they will be around since it's widely spoken by the young Jeju population even now. They speak with a standard Korean plus the Jejuo dialect a bit with the vocabs and words. But definitely, I think the original Jejuo that's spoken by the elderly population there will soon disappear together with the elderly population. And in fact, the director of the Jeju Language Institute, Kang Young-bong, was telling me that they were really just trying to delay this process of the Jejuo dying out because it's going to be impossible to preserve it for good.
Well, ladies, really interesting reports. And our listeners, a reminder, you can watch Michiyo and Yunsook's stories on YouTube as well as on CNA.Asia. Thank you very much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. Thanks very much for listening today. This episode was brought to you by Faiz, Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Teresa Tang. See you next week.